Hey guys, tonight we're pulling up a chair at the most dangerous dinner table in America. The world of the 1950s Mafia wife. Not the Hollywood version, where everyone's draped in fur and looking glamorous while someone gets shot tastefully off screen. I mean the real thing. The Sunday gravy, the unexplained absences, the envelopes of cash you're not supposed to ask about, the husband who comes home smelling like cigars and secrets. So before you get comfortable, I just want to say a genuinely warm thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you have excellent taste and possibly a suspicious amount of knowledge about organised crime. Your suggestions shape this channel more than you know, and I mean that. So if you enjoy what I do here, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure. No horseheads on your pillow if you don't. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time. It is for you. Somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I love that for us. And if you prefer your questionable history on the go, we are now on Spotify. Link is in the description. Check it out. Now, dim those lights. Put on a fan. Pull your blanket up to your chin. Maybe check under the bed, not for monsters, just out of habit, because tonight's world rewards caution. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to be a mafia wife in 1950s America? Did you just know? Did someone sit you down and explain the rules? Or did you figure it out the hard way when your husband came home at 3 a.m. with a wad of cash and a very unconvincing story about a late poker game? What did you do when the FBI knocked on your door and your husband was standing right behind you in his undershirt? Did you smile? Did you offer them coffee? Did you lie so smoothly that you surprised even yourself? What did you cook for Sunday dinner when 12 men showed up unannounced and 2 of them were visibly nervous? Did you ask questions, or did you learn very quickly that the best thing you could do was keep the sauce on low and your mouth even lower? Could you navigate a life where your husband was respected, feared, and possibly wanted in 3 states? All while keeping the kids in Catholic school and the neighbours none the wiser? Congratulations. You've just woken up at 1952. You're in a brick row house in South Philadelphia, or maybe Queens, or maybe a tidy suburb of Chicago that smells like cut grass, and something you're choosing not to investigate. Your husband is already gone. There's an envelope on the kitchen table. You don't count it. You already know the rules, even if no one ever said them out loud. Welcome to life. Let's start at the beginning, because nobody accidentally married into the mob. Or maybe they did. A little. In 1950s America, these men were not walking around with signs around their necks. They were charming. They were well dressed. They opened car doors and brought flowers and had this easy, magnetic confidence that made everything feel safe, which was, of course, the single greatest irony of your entire life. You met him at a dance, or through your cousin, or at a neighbourhood restaurant where he always seemed to have the best table without ever making a reservation. He was funny, attentive, and generous in a way that felt different from the other boys, the ones who split a soda and looked nervous doing it. He never split anything. He paid for everything. And the money, well, you asked once. Just once. He smiled and said he was in business. You were young. You let that be enough. Here is what you did not know, because you were 17 or 19 or 21, and possessed of exactly the amount of worldly knowledge that those ages carry. You did not know that the confidence was not just personality. It was rank. The ease with which he moved, through a room, the way he was greeted before he'd spoken, the way nobody ever gave him a hard time about anything. Those were not the qualities of a charming man. They were the qualities of a man who occupied a specific, understood position in a very specific, very old social structure. You didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. You just thought he was exceptional. And he was. Just not entirely in the ways you were imagining. The courtship was lovely. Genuinely. He brought you flowers on a Tuesday for no reason, because that was the kind of thing he did. Impulsive, generous, slightly theatrical gestures that made you feel like the most important person in whatever room you were in. He took you to restaurants that were too good for the occasion and introduced you to people who shook your hand with both of theirs and looked at you with an evaluating warmth, as though you were being considered for something. You were. You just didn't know what. Your family liked him immediately. Your father, who was a careful man and did not like people quickly as a rule, liked him the third time he came to dinner. Your mother had liked him the first time. He brought wine and sat with your father and talked about baseball and local politics, and asked questions and listened to the answers, which is a rare enough quality in a young man that everyone noticed it. He was, on every visible surface, a catch. That surface was very polished. It reflected exactly what you were meant to see. There were small things looking back. There always are looking back. The friends who deferred to him in a particular way. The times a conversation would pause when you entered a room and resume only after it had become a different conversation. The way he was always comfortable, never hurried, never broke, even before he would have had any logical reason to be financially secure. These are the things you notice in retrospect, fitting them together like a puzzle whose picture you only understand after it's complete. But in the moment you were a young woman being courted by a man who made you feel like something good was coming, and something was. It just came with an instruction you hadn't received yet, an instruction that would arrive after the wedding, quietly, in the form of a look that said, "There are things we don't discuss." You would understand it completely, and by then, you would also understand that understanding it was the only reasonable option. The door you'd walk through didn't open from the inside, but standing in the courtship in those early months of flowers and good restaurants and a man who paid for everything and asked nothing, you were happy. That part was real. Don't let anyone take that from you. Your wedding was the most beautiful day of your life, and in retrospect, a fairly detailed preview of everything that was coming. The guest list was enormous, and included at least a dozen men you'd never met, all of whom seemed to know each other very well, and spoke in low voices near the bar. The envelopes, the gifts, were thick. Thicker than anyone at your office or church would have sent. The flowers were excessive. The food was extraordinary. Someone kept disappearing into a back room, and it was never your uncle who did it. Your mother cried for reasons you assumed were sentimental. You danced in a white dress and told yourself this was simply what a real wedding looked like. Full of life, full of people who loved your husband, full of men in suits who shook hands too long and laughed too carefully. You were radiant. You were also, without knowing it, now part of something much larger than a marriage. The reception was held at a hall that had been reserved for months, decorated with more flowers than you had requested, and a quantity of food that suggested someone had anticipated a significantly larger crowd than the one you'd planned for. This turned out to be accurate. People arrived who were not on your guest list, greeted by your new husband with the warmth of old friendship, absorbed into the party as though they had always been expected. You were introduced. You smiled. You shook hands. You were gracious. You had been raised to be gracious, which would turn out to be one of the most useful things your parents ever gave you. The men at your wedding carried themselves in a specific way, not loud, not aggressive, nothing like the movies that would later try to represent them. They were quiet, well-dressed, attentive to their surroundings in a manner that was almost gentle, and possessed of a social ease that came from knowing exactly where they stood in a very clear hierarchy. They were courteous to you, warmly so. You were, after all, the new wife, and the new wife was to be treated with respect. You would understand later that this respect was genuine but also structural. You occupied a role, and the role was honoured, and the honouring of it was its own kind of communication about what was expected in return. Your new husband was the centre of gravity in that room. You'd thought it was simply because it was his wedding day. People gravitated toward him, deferred to him, lit up when he turned in their direction. He moved through his own reception like a man entirely at home in his own importance, which he was, because he had been for years. You orbited him that day in your white dress and thought, he is extraordinary, and you weren't wrong. You were just still working with incomplete information. The envelopes, when you finally sat down to open them days later, were staggering. Not vulgar. Nothing about this world was ever vulgar in its presentation. That was rather the point, but substantial in a way that told you something about the people who had sent them without telling you anything at all. Cash, carefully tucked into cards with brief, warm inscriptions. You counted it once and then put it away and never mentioned the total to anyone, which was the correct instinct arrived at naturally, which in itself was a kind of beginning. You look back at your wedding photograph sometimes and you see it. The particular quality of the room, the way everyone is dressed just a little too well for a Saturday afternoon, the arrangement of certain men near certain other men, in a way that suggests not randomness but order. At the time, it just looked like a beautiful party, which it was. That was also real. The beauty was not a lie. It was just also something else. There is a rule in this life. It isn't written down. Nobody explains it at a sit-down or hands you a pamphlet on your honeymoon. But you learn it within the first few weeks, maybe sooner, delivered not with words but with a look, a gentle, patient, unmistakable look from your husband the one time you asked a question you shouldn't have. Nothing frightening, nothing dramatic. Just a quiet pause and then a subject change so smooth it was almost impressive. And in that pause you understood everything. You don't ask where he goes. You don't ask who called. You don't ask why there's a different car in the driveway, or why Tuesday's plans changed at 10 o'clock at night, or why a man you've never seen before dropped something off in a paper bag and left without saying a word. You learn very quickly that in this house knowledge has a price, and the price is always higher than it looks. The look itself was not unkind. That is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who wasn't there, because people assume it must have been threatening, controlling, a demonstration of dominance. It was none of those things. Exactly. It was more like the look a person gives you when you've reached for a hot pan and they'd like you to withdraw your hand before you burn yourself. Patient, concerned even, slightly tired, as though the question had been one of a kind that he'd hoped wouldn't come but had known eventually would. It communicated, without a single word, this is not a direction we go. And then the subject changed and dinner resumed, and later that evening he was warm and present, and nothing was different except that you now knew, with great precision, where one of the walls was. You adjusted quickly because you were a practical woman who understood that adjustment was available to you and refusal was not. Or rather, refusal would cost more than adjustment. This was not resignation. This was strategy. You kept your curiosity in a room inside yourself, and you kept that room quiet. And over time it became less like suppression and more like the natural state of things. You stopped forming questions that went in certain directions, the way you stop reaching for a door that you know doesn't open, not because someone stopped you, because you learned the architecture. What replaced the questions was observation. You became, without quite deciding to be, extraordinarily good at reading what was happening around you without asking about it. The tone of a phone call told you more than its content. The way your husband moved when he came home, quickly or slowly, relaxed or tightly composed, told you what kind of evening was coming before he'd said a word. The presence or absence of certain men at the table told you something about the current state of things. You built a comprehensive, detailed, perpetually updated picture of your life, using nothing but peripheral information, and you never once acknowledged that you were doing it. That is the kind of intelligence that has no name on a resume and no certificate on a wall. But it was real, and it was yours, and it kept you afloat. Other women in your circle navigated this same architecture, and occasionally, very briefly, in the most indirect terms, you would acknowledge it to each other. A certain look exchanged at a coffee table, a particular way of finishing a sentence that stopped just before the part that wasn't said. You understood each other perfectly and never confirmed what you understood, which was its own kind of intimacy, the intimacy of people who have agreed, without agreeing, on a shared way of surviving. The rule was not discussed. The rule was lived daily in small and total ways by every woman at that table. You became so practiced at the rule that it stopped feeling like a constraint. It became something closer to a posture, a way of holding yourself in relation to the world. And in the privacy of your own mind, in the room where you kept the questions quiet, you knew everything. You simply never said so. Which is, when you think about it, the most powerful position available. You were the most informed person in the house. You just kept it to yourself. Your house was immaculate. It had to be. In the world of the 1950s mob wife, a clean home was not a preference. It was armour. The neighbours noticed everything. The priest noticed everything. And in neighbourhoods where everyone knew everyone and gossip travelled faster than the morning paper, your kitchen floors and ironed curtains and trimmed front hedge were a kind of ongoing performance. We are a normal family, nothing to see here. Please admire my window boxes. You scrubbed and polished and organised with the ferocity of a woman who had learned that outward order was the only kind she could control. Inside, the pantry was always full in a way that was difficult to explain on your husband's stated income. The furniture was good. The car was newer than it should have been. Nobody asked. You didn't offer. You just kept everything very, very clean. The house itself was a particular kind of 1950s working class to middle class home that had been elevated carefully and without ostentation a few degrees above its neighbours. Not a mansion. Nothing about this world called attention to itself, which was a survival principle with aesthetic consequences. But the kitchen appliances were newer. The living room furniture was better quality. There was a television, when televisions were still something people remarked on. The curtains were real fabric, not the approximation of it. These were the small signals of prosperity that everyone noticed and nobody commented on, because in a neighbourhood where your husband was known to be connected, commenting on his wife's curtains was not something you did unless you wanted a conversation you hadn't planned for. You cleaned with purpose, and you cleaned completely. The kitchen was scrubbed every morning before 7. The floors were swept and then mopped, in that order, always. The bathroom was cleaned daily because guests arrived without warning, and you were not going to be the woman whose bathroom was caught unprepared. You ironed everything: shirts, tablecloths, the children's school uniforms, your own aprons. The ironing board was never far from being set up, because there was always something that needed doing, and the discipline of it was, you found, genuinely calming. Control the pressing. Control the surface. It was manageable, unlike most things. Company arrived frequently and without much notice. A call from your husband in the afternoon meaning there would be people for dinner was not unusual. 4 people might become 8 between the phone call and the actual meal, and you would account for this without visible distress because you had learned to cook in quantities that assumed expansion. The table was always set properly. The food was always enough. Guests left full and comfortable and with the specific impression that this was a household of substance, orderly, warm, competent. That impression was entirely intentional and entirely accurate. You'd built it one clean surface at a time. The neighbours assessed you through the narrow lens of your front step and your front windows, and what they saw was respectable. A woman who kept her house, who managed her children, whose garden was tended and whose garbage was always put out on the correct morning. Normal, in every visible particular. That normalcy was your daily work product, the thing you manufactured and maintained and presented to the outside world with a consistency that would have exhausted anyone who didn't understand why it mattered. You understood exactly why it mattered, and so the house stayed clean, the curtains stayed pressed, and the window boxes, every spring, were replanted with fresh flowers. Geraniums usually, red ones. They were cheerful, and cheerful was the appropriate surface, and you had never once let the surface slip. If there was one thing that anchored the week, one ritual that made everything feel almost normal, it was Sunday, and Sunday meant sauce. You were up before 7, browning the meat, coaxing the tomatoes, adjusting the heat with the instincts of someone who had watched her mother do the same since she could reach the stove. The gravy had to be right because Sunday meant people, and people meant scrutiny, and the one thing nobody could criticize, the one thing that was entirely and inarguably yours, was the food. Men came and went from your kitchen all afternoon. Conversations happened in the other room. You heard words and chose not to hear them. You stirred the pot and kept your eyes forward and understood that your gravy was not just dinner. It was the reason everyone had an excuse to be there. A cover that smelled like basil and red wine and something warm and civilized, no matter what was being discussed on the other side of the wall. The sauce started with the meat. Pork ribs, braciole rolled tight with garlic and parsley and tied with kitchen string. Sometimes a good Italian sausage if the week had been generous. You browned everything in batches in the heavy pan, the one your mother had passed down, the one that had seasoned itself over decades into something that could not be replicated by a newer pan, no matter how good. The sizzle of it in the morning was the sound of Sunday beginning, a sound so familiar and so anchoring that it could cut through almost any level of background worry like a hand on a shoulder. Here, this, now, brown the meat. The tomatoes were San Marzano, or as close to it as you could get, crushed by hand over the pot because your mother had done it that way and her mother before her. And there was no arguing with a technique that had produced results across 3 generations of women who knew what they were doing. Garlic went in, olive oil, a bay leaf, thyme. The sauce needed time above everything else. It needed to be left alone to become what it was going to be, which was something you understood in a way that extended well beyond cooking. Some things required patience and low heat, and the discipline not to interfere. The sauce knew this about itself. You had learned it too. By midday, the house smelled like the best possible version of Sunday, which was a scent that did specific work. It communicated abundance, care, tradition, domesticity. It was impossible to walk into a house that smelled like that and think anything suspicious was happening, because suspicious things did not happen in houses where someone had been tending a pot since 7 in the morning. The gravy was your alibi in the most benign and delicious sense of the word. It said, "There is a woman here who's been cooking for hours. A woman cooking for hours is a woman anchored, present, purposeful. Look at the pot. Look at the family. Everything here is exactly what it appears to be." The people who arrived for Sunday dinner were never fewer than 8 and sometimes considerably more. You fed them all. The table expanded, leaves inserted, an extra chair produced from somewhere, another setting laid without fuss. You did this the way you did most things, seamlessly, without making it a production, as though abundance was simply the natural state of your kitchen, which by design it always was. The food was the common ground on which everyone stood. Men who might have been tense, or cautious or careful with their words, relaxed over your Sunday table in a way that nothing else quite achieved. That relaxation was useful. It was also, frankly, a pleasure to produce. You were an exceptional cook, and you knew it, and that knowledge was one of the few unqualified satisfactions available to you in a life that required so much to remain unacknowledged. The gravy was yours. It was above reproach. And on Sunday, at least, everything that mattered happened around it. Inside your house, he was a father. He kissed the kids goodnight. He complained about the news. He had opinions about baseball and strong ones about coffee, and sometimes he fell asleep in the armchair on a Sunday and snored in a way that was almost endearing. Inside your house he was, by most available evidence, a regular man. But you knew, not from anything he said, and never from anything you saw directly, that outside your door he was something different. You could feel it in the way other men looked at him, the way a room shifted when he walked into it, the way waiters never brought a check without being asked. He carried authority like a second coat, and he wore it so naturally that sometimes you forgot it was there, until the moment you remembered all at once, usually at an inconvenient time, like a Tuesday afternoon when someone knocked on the door and he was already standing very still in the kitchen, before you'd even heard the sound. Inside the house he was yours, in the way that a husband belongs to a household, present, familiar, occasionally maddening in the specific ways that proximity produces. He left his shoes in places that were not the closet. He had opinions about how the coffee should be made that were wrong but held with great conviction. He read the newspaper at the kitchen table and provided his commentary on its contents to no one in particular, and expected no response. Which was fortunate because the commentary was delivered too quietly to follow. He was in this way exactly like any other man of his generation and neighbourhood and temperament, and you loved these qualities in him. The ordinariness of them, the way they made the inside of the house feel like a different country from whatever existed beyond its walls. But outside was the thing. You saw it most clearly when you attended events together, a church function, a neighbourhood gathering, another family celebration. You would watch him enter a room, and the room would subtly reorganise itself around his arrival. Not in an obvious way. Nothing about this world was ever obvious. But the attention would shift, quietly, the way a compass needle shifts when a magnet comes near it. Men who had been mid-conversation would resolve themselves toward him. People made space physically without appearing to do so, and your husband would move through this rearranged room with the total ease of a man who had never experienced the opposite. He was not frightening. That is the thing that surprises people. People imagine menace, intimidation, a coldness behind the eyes. What you observed was almost the opposite. A man of enormous social warmth, genuinely interested in the people around him, capable of making anyone feel heard, attended to, important. This quality was natural. It was also the quality that had built his position, because people who feel important in your presence become loyal to you, and loyalty was the actual currency of his world, more valuable than any other and considerably harder to counterfeit. At home he was the volume turned down. He appreciated this. The children could approach him. He could sit in the yard on a summer evening and simply be a man sitting in a yard. There were stretches of time, particularly on slow Sundays after a large meal, when your household felt so entirely ordinary that you could almost forget the version of him that existed outside it. Almost. There was always, somewhere in the back of your awareness, a small and vigilant part of you that did not entirely forget. The part that listened for the phone, that noted when he went quiet, that registered the difference between an evening he was at ease and an evening he was merely performing ease. That part of you never rested. But it had learned to run very quietly, so as not to spoil the Sunday. You were not alone in this, and that, honestly, was the thing that made it survivable. There were other women, wives and daughters and sisters-in-law, who occupied the same careful, unspoken world you did. You met at church, at school pickups, at each other's kitchen tables over coffee and pastries that were always slightly too good for 11 o'clock on a Wednesday. You talked about children, about recipes, about the price of things, about television programs and neighbourhood gossip and the kind of ordinary domestic concerns that would have bored anyone listening from the outside. What you did not talk about, what none of you ever talked about, was the thing you all had in common, You didn't need to. You understood each other in the silences, in the practiced way you all changed the subject, in the knowing nod when someone's husband was mentioned and then quickly wasn't. These women were your real family. They were the ones who showed up with food when something happened. They were the ones who knew and never said. The friendships were real. They were not strategic alliances wearing the costume of friendship. They were actual relationships, built over years of proximity and shared experience, of watching each other's children grow up and helping each other through the particular difficulties of lives lived in this specific key. You loved these women. You trusted them in the way that trust develops between people who have, over a long time, proven themselves trustworthy in the only conditions that truly test the thing, the hard ones. What you shared and never named was a comprehensive expertise in a very particular skill set. You all knew how to answer a door at an unexpected hour without visible alarm. You all knew how to accept news, good or bad, with the same composed expression, because displaying either relief or distress in the wrong company was a liability. You all knew how to redirect a conversation that was moving toward territory it shouldn't reach, smoothly enough that the person being redirected usually didn't notice they'd been moved. You were collectively the most socially sophisticated group of women in any room you entered, and nobody outside your circle would have guessed it, because the sophistication expressed itself as warmth and normalcy, rather than anything that read as intelligence. Which was, of course, exactly the point. When something difficult happened, an arrest, a disappearance, a crisis of any variety, these women appeared. They didn't ask questions and they didn't offer opinions. They appeared with food, with their physical presence, with a competent and calming energy that said, "We have been through things and we know how to be here for someone who is going through things." They sat with you. They occupied your kitchen so you weren't alone in it. They took your children for an afternoon without making it seem like a significant gesture. They were, in the most practical sense, the infrastructure that kept you standing during the moments when standing required external support. Outside the circle, your friendships were pleasant but thinner. Women who didn't live this particular life couldn't fully reach you, and you couldn't fully reach them because there was a central fact of your existence that you could never put on the table, and a friendship with a significant portion of your life missing from it is necessarily a partial thing. You were friendly, warm, present in your community. But the kitchen table conversations, the real ones, the ones where you could exhale, those happened with the women who already knew the shape of what you were carrying. They knew. You knew they knew. That knowing, shared and unspoken, was the closest thing you had to being fully understood. The money came. That was the thing about it. It always came, in ways and amounts that didn't follow any logic you could trace. Your husband might go out for an evening and come back with enough to cover a month of groceries and a new winter coat, or he might mention, very casually, that you should go to the furniture store this week because he'd already spoken to the man there. There were no payslips. There was no employer. There was, in the language of the household, simply business, a word that covered an enormous amount of territory and was never subdivided further in your presence. You got good at spending it without examining it, at depositing what you were told to deposit and not asking about the rest. You were not naive. You knew the money was not clean, but you also knew it paid for the children's school books and your mother's doctor and the roof that needed fixing in 1954. And so you stirred your gravy and you didn't ask. The practical management of money in your household was a particular kind of discipline. Cash was the primary currency, which meant there were no paper trails, no statements, no documents that could be produced in a courtroom and explained. You kept the household accounts in your head, which was where they needed to be, not written down, not in a ledger, not anywhere that could be found and examined. You knew what things cost, you knew what you had. You moved money around with the quiet competence of a woman who has understood intuitively that money management and information management are the same skill applied to different materials. There were envelopes. They appeared in reliable ways, left on the kitchen table, handed over without ceremony, occasionally delivered by someone other than your husband in a manner that required you to simply accept the envelope and say thank you and ask nothing further. The amounts varied. You learned not to be surprised by either the size or the timing. A lean week followed by a generous one, followed by 3 weeks of nothing, followed by a sum that resolved all accumulated concerns. This was the rhythm of it, and you budgeted accordingly, keeping a reserve that you kept quiet about because reserves were private and privacy was protection. The neighbours had some awareness that your household operated on a different financial basis from theirs. This awareness was never discussed. In working-class neighbourhoods in the 1950s, the polite fiction was that everyone's money came from somewhere comprehensible, and if the details of your particular comprehensible source were vague, that was between you and whatever accounting you did or didn't do. What people saw was prosperity managed with discretion, good food, decent clothes, a well-kept house, children who went to the right school. Nothing that screamed excess, everything that communicated. Stability. Stability was the goal. Excess was a liability. You had understood this from very early on, and you dressed and furnished and lived accordingly. The cost of the money was the knowing that it was not clean, and the choosing, daily, not to examine that knowing too directly. Other women in other circumstances might have found this psychologically complicated. You found it manageable, because the alternative, interrogating every dollar's origin, following the chain of it backward to wherever it began, was not actually available to you, and would have produced no useful outcome. You were not the origin of the money, you were its steward. You kept it, allocated it, and made it produce the orderly, respectable, comfortable life that was your household's external face. You were very good at this. The roof got fixed. Your mother's doctor got paid. The children's school books were bought on time every year without drama. That was the job. You did the job. They came eventually. They always came. 2 men in dark suits who were too polished for the neighbourhood and had the particular brand of flat, patient politeness that meant they were not being polite at all. They might be waiting by the car when you came back from the market, or they might ring the doorbell on a Tuesday morning with your husband standing just out of view in the hallway, and you would open the door and smile with your grocery bag still in your arms, like a woman who had absolutely nothing to hide. You learned what to say, not from anyone telling you directly, just from understanding, bone deep, that you said nothing. He's not home. I don't know about that. I really couldn't say. You offered them nothing, not a flicker, not a stumble, not a single unplanned word, and then you closed the door and put the groceries away, and your hands were perfectly steady, because in this life, your hands were always steady, even when everything else was not. The FBI surveillance of organized crime families in 1950s. America was persistent and methodical. Agents watched houses, photographed visitors, recorded license plates, conducted interviews with neighbours and acquaintances, and anyone who might have something useful to offer. They were thorough, well-resourced, and motivated by a mandate that had come, in part, from the 1951 Kefauver hearings that had put organised crime on national television and turned it into a political priority. You knew this not because you followed politics closely, but because you lived inside the target of it, and that gave you a perspective on federal law enforcement that was considerably more immediate than anything available to the general public. The agents who came to your door were not intimidating in any theatrical sense. They were professional. That was, in its way, more unnerving than anger would have been, because professionalism implied patience, and patience implied that this was not a one-time visit, but the beginning of a longer conversation that you were going to have to navigate indefinitely. They asked polite questions. They thanked you for your time. They handed you a card and suggested you call if you thought of anything. You took the card with both hands and smiled and said, "Of course," and called no one. because the card went into the kitchen drawer, and the kitchen drawer was where cards went to be forgotten. You were aware when they came that the conversation was being conducted on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, a pleasant exchange of no information. Beneath that, an assessment of you as a source, a witness, a potential pressure point. They were looking for cracks, anxiety, resentment, any indication that you might be reachable. What they found was a composed, cooperative, entirely uninformative woman who offered them coffee with a sincerity that was itself a kind of information. She's not afraid. She is practiced. She has done this before. This is a household that will not be leveraged through its wife. After they left, and they always left without anything useful, you put the groceries away methodically, one item at a time, and you did not say anything until you were certain the car was gone from in front of the house. Then you informed your husband, briefly, what had been asked and what had been said, leaving out nothing and adding nothing. He listened. He nodded. He said you did fine, which was the greatest compliment available in that context, and you went back to whatever you had been doing, because the alternative was to stand in the kitchen feeling things you had learned not to stand still long enough to feel. Productivity was its own form of composure. You were always productive. You were a mother first. Whatever else was true, that part was simple and whole and entirely yours. The children went to Catholic school in pressed uniforms. They did their homework at the kitchen table. They were polite to adults, attended Mass without complaint, and understood from a young age, without being told because the very best lessons in your household were never told, that there were things you didn't discuss outside the house. Not from shame exactly. It was more like weather, just a condition of your particular life that you accepted and moved around. Your kids were loved. They were fed. They had birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and a father who showed up to things and was, on those occasions, warm and present and genuinely funny. What they also had was an instinct, sharp and early, for when to leave a room. You taught them that without saying a word. It was perhaps the most important thing you ever taught them. The Catholic school was not incidental. It was central to the architecture of your children's public identity, because a child in Catholic school uniform is a child whose family has made a legible, respectable, community-affirming choice, and legibility was precious. The nuns were demanding and consistent and entirely uninterested in what your husband did for a living, which was precisely the correct level of interest. Your children were taught discipline, obedience, academic rigour, and the importance of presenting well, all of which aligned neatly with your own priorities and none of which asked any difficult questions about the family's income source. At home, you raised them in the same silence you had been initiated into, but with the tenderness that the raising of children requires. You did not sit them down and explain the structure of their father's world. You did not issue warnings or instructions. What you did was model, consistently and without drama, the behaviours that would keep them safe: discretion, composure, the practiced art of saying nothing useful while appearing to say something pleasant. Children are extraordinarily good at learning from observation when observation is what's available. Yours observed and absorbed and became, by the time they were in their teens, socially fluent in ways that their classmates weren't, in a manner that their teachers probably attributed to good upbringing and their classmates found vaguely impressive. They knew their father was respected. They knew that respect had a particular texture in their neighbourhood, not the respect given to a teacher or a doctor, but something older and less institutional. They knew that certain things were not discussed at school or with friends' parents, or with the distant relatives who came at Christmas and asked too many questions. They knew these things not from instruction, but from the air of the house, which carried the knowledge in it the way houses carry the smell of what's been cooked in them, pervasively, invisibly, until it's simply the smell of home. You worried about them, as mothers worry, but your worries had a specific geography. You worried about the day one of them would be old enough to understand more completely what the family was and what they would do with that understanding. You worried about the pull, whether the boys especially would find the world their father inhabited glamorous rather than cautionary, whether the life would reach forward and claim the next generation. These were the worries you carried at 3 a.m. when the house was quiet. During the day you made their lunches and checked their homework and drove them to their appointments and loved them with the full and uncomplicated force of a mother who has decided that her children will be, no matter what else is true, entirely and completely fine. You made sure they were. That was the one thing in your life that was entirely non-negotiable. You did not leave the house looking anything less than put together. This was not vanity, it was policy. In 1950s America, a well-dressed woman was a respectable woman, and respectable was the single most important thing you could be when your husband's professional associations were what they were. You wore shirtwaist dresses and good heels. Your hair was set and your lipstick was always on before 10 a.m. You looked, at all times, like a woman whose husband was in legitimate business. This took effort. It took time. It took a certain steely cheerfulness that you had developed into something almost genuine over the years. Your appearance was a form of communication. We are fine, we are normal, there is nothing unusual happening in this house, and if there is, look how nicely my collar is pressed. You were very, very good at it. The 1950s were, fortuitously, a decade in which looking put together was a broadly shared cultural expectation for women, which meant your commitment to it did not stand out as unusual. Every woman on your block set her hair and wore a dress and kept her lipstick on. What distinguished you was not the effort but the consistency of it. The fact that you never had a day where the effort slipped. Never a Tuesday morning where you answered the door in a housecoat looking tired. Because the door might be anyone, and anyone seeing you unprepared was a small but real failure of the performance you were required to maintain every waking hour. Your wardrobe was not extravagant. Extravagance attracted attention, and attention was a cost you could not afford. It was, however, carefully chosen and impeccably maintained. 3 or 4 good dresses rotated through the week, each pressed, each appropriate, each the colour of a woman who has her life entirely in order. You had one good coat, dark, well-cut, worn to church and to school functions, and to any occasion that required you to be seen in public in a manner that would later be described by someone as, "She always looked so lovely." That was the target. Lovely, composed, present. The kind of woman who could not possibly be involved in anything complicated. The hair was a Saturday production. You went to the salon every week without exception, because hair that had been neglected for more than 7 days communicated disorder, and disorder was not a communication you were making. The women at the salon knew you, knew your husband by name if not by profession, and understood that you were a regular who tipped well and expected results. Your hair was set and dried under the dryer in the row of women reading magazines, all of you performing the same ritual maintenance that the decade required, and you emerged each Saturday looking exactly as a woman of your neighbourhood and standing should look, ready, armoured, immovable. The lipstick was the final element and perhaps the most essential. Red, usually, or a deep rose, a colour that read as confident without reading as aggressive, which was a distinction you understood intuitively and applied precisely. You put it on in the mirror over the bathroom sink every morning before the children came downstairs, because the children should see a mother who was ready, not a mother who was assembling herself. Ready was what you were, ready was what you projected. The lipstick was the seal on the whole enterprise. The house is clean, the children are pressed, the sauce is on, and I am, by every available measure, a woman with nothing whatsoever to hide. It was exhausting. It was also, in the specific way that expertise becomes its own reward, satisfying. You were exceptional at it, and in a life where so much was out of your hands, Being exceptional at the part you controlled was no small thing. Here is the thing people always get wrong. You were not stupid. Not even close. You were, in many ways, one of the smartest people in any room you entered, because you had learned to perform a very specific kind of not knowing that required constant, exhausting intelligence to maintain. You knew enough. You knew more than enough. The shape of things was clear to you. The hierarchy, the relationships, the nature of the business, the reasons certain names were spoken carefully and others not at all. What you had cultivated with great precision and genuine self-preservation was the ability to know without knowing in any way that could ever be repeated, confirmed, or used against you or anyone in your family. It is a skill that has no name but deserves one. It is knowing as a form of protection, and you practiced it every single day. The hierarchy was something you had mapped in your mind with the thoroughness of someone who understood that maps could save your life. You knew who was above your husband and roughly how far above. You knew who was lateral to him, and whether those relationships were warm or merely functional. You knew who was beneath, and you were careful with the wives of those men, friendly, generous, never condescending, because the hierarchy shifted and the woman you look down on today could be looking at you from above tomorrow, and in this world those reversals happened. You knew all of this without having been told any of it explicitly, which meant that if someone had sat you down and asked you to describe the organizational structure of your husband's professional life, you could have truthfully said you had no idea what they were talking about. The map was in your head. It was not available for consultation. Names were a particular form of knowledge that required careful management. You heard them, registered them, filed them in the back of your mind where they lived without being acknowledged or repeated. A name spoken at your dinner table was a name you had never heard. A name mentioned in a phone call was a name that had passed through you like water through a clean glass, present for a moment and then gone, leaving nothing behind. You could sit across from a federal agent and confirm with total composure that you didn't recognize the name they'd mentioned, because the version of you that was sitting in that conversation genuinely did not know it. The version of you that kept the map had heard it 3 times. Those were 2 different rooms in the same building, and you were very good at keeping the doors closed. The calibration was the art of it. You needed to know enough to protect your family, to recognize danger when it was approaching, to understand when the situation in your household required a specific kind of attention. A woman who knew nothing at all was a woman who couldn't protect herself or her children. So you maintained a working knowledge that was sufficient for safety and insufficient for testimony. It was a precise instrument, tuned by years of practice, and it required constant maintenance. Too much curiosity, and you became a liability. Too little awareness, and you became vulnerable. The space between those 2 failures was where you lived. What you had, ultimately, was a comprehensive understanding of your life that you expressed as ignorance. This is a thing that sounds simple and is, in practice, one of the most cognitively demanding performances available to a human being. Lawyers train for years to do a lesser version of it. You learned it by living inside the necessity of it, which is a faster and considerably more motivating curriculum. You were, in this particular skill, self-taught and entirely without peer, and you went to your grave knowing things that no one else ever knew, which is a kind of power that outlasts any title, any testimony, and any court proceeding that was ever convened in the general vicinity of your family's name. The telephone was, in your household, a complicated instrument. It hung on the kitchen wall and it rang at all hours, and you answered it with a cheerful hello that gave away absolutely nothing, because you never knew who was on the other end. Sometimes it was a woman from church. Sometimes it was your mother. Sometimes it was a man whose voice you recognized but whose name you did not know, asking for your husband in a tone that meant the conversation had already been decided somewhere else. You took messages. You passed them on. You forgot them immediately. afterward in that specific way that meant you could honestly say, later if asked, that you couldn't remember the details. You also understood that your phone was very possibly listened to on occasion, which meant your conversations were careful things, cheerful, domestic, utterly unremarkable on the surface, like the telephone equivalent of your window boxes. FBI wiretapping of suspected organised crime figures was a documented practice in 1950s America, and while legal standards around surveillance were different from what they would later become, the awareness that your telephone line might be a listening device was something women in your position carried at all times. This awareness was not paranoia. It was operational reality, communicated not through explicit warning, but through the general culture of the world you inhabited, which understood in its bones that careless communication was a form of self-destruction. You spoke on the phone accordingly, which is to say, carefully, warmly, about nothing that mattered. Your conversations on the telephone were a specific kind of social art. With your mother, you discussed the children and the weather, and whether she needed anything brought over on Thursday. With the women from church, you discussed the upcoming fundraiser and who was bringing what dish, and wasn't it a shame about Mrs. Caruso's knee. With your sister-in-law, you talked about the children again, and a television programme, and whether the new butcher on the corner was any good. These were real conversations. They were also, simultaneously, conversations that could have been listened to by anyone in the country and yielded absolutely nothing. You were not performing for an imagined audience. You had simply learned to have only the conversations that were survivable in any context. The rest happened in person, in your kitchen, in the specific privacy of a room where you knew who was present. When your husband's associates called, the protocol was immediate and total. He's not available right now. I'll let him know you called. No, I don't know when he'll be back. Yes, of course. Goodbye. You hung up the phone and walked to wherever your husband was and delivered the message in the fewest possible words, and then you returned to what you had been doing. If you had been making dinner when the call came, dinner continued. If you'd been helping with homework, homework continued. The call was a parenthesis, inserted and closed without disrupting the surrounding sentence. This too was practiced, and the practice had made it smooth enough that the children barely looked up. The kitchen wall phone was, in retrospect, the nerve centre of your household's information management, the point at which the outside world attempted to make contact, and you mediated that contact with absolute control over what passed through. You were, in the language of a later era, a firewall. Information came in through you and was processed and distributed only in the form and to the extent that was appropriate. Nothing else got through. The phone rang and you answered it, and the world outside encountered once again a pleasant and entirely uninformative woman who wished them a good day and gave them nothing to work with. The phone hung back on the wall. Dinner continued. The household went on. The neighbourhood was its own ecosystem. In South Philly or Carroll Gardens or the north end of Boston or any of the dozen places where this life played out, the streets were dense with people who had known each other their entire lives. Your neighbours watched, not maliciously mostly, just as a fact of proximity. They noticed when the car wasn't in the driveway. They noticed unfamiliar visitors. They noticed when you looked tired and when you didn't, and they formed opinions about both. You navigated this with the careful social grace of a diplomat. You were friendly without being close, warm without being confiding, available for a chat over the fence without ever saying anything that lodged. You were a good neighbour in the most thorough and least informative way possible. You brought food when someone was sick. You smiled at the right moments. You were, in every observable way, unremarkable. It was an achievement. The geography of these neighbourhoods was not accidental. Organised crime in 1950s, America was largely a neighbourhood phenomenon, rooted in specific blocks, specific parishes, specific communities that had formed around Italian or Sicilian immigrant populations and had developed over generations their own internal codes and loyalties. Your husband did not operate in the abstract. He operated in a place, among people he had grown up with, whose families he knew, whose children went to school with his children. The neighbourhood was not just where you lived. It was the medium through which the entire structure of his world was conducted, and you were embedded in it daily, visibly, in a way that required constant management. The older women on the block were the most important social constituency you maintained. They had been there longer than anyone. They had seen everything, and they spoke to each other with a frequency and candour that made them the most effective information network in a half-mile radius. You were respectful to them, genuinely, not performatively, because they deserved respect and also because their goodwill was worth maintaining. You asked after their health. You brought things over. You stopped for conversations of appropriate length about appropriate subjects. They in turn regarded you with the specific warmth they reserved for women who conducted themselves properly, which meant women who kept their houses clean, their children behaved, and their personal business personal. You satisfied all three criteria without visible effort. You were, among the older women of the block, considered a credit to the neighbourhood. The younger couples were navigated differently, friendlier, more social, but still with the same underlying care. You had people over for dinner. You attended their children's birthdays and communions. You were present in all the ways that made you a participating member of a community rather than someone who stood apart and invited speculation. Standing apart invited speculation. Participation generated the comfortable low-attention assessment of, she's a nice woman, they're a nice family. That assessment was the goal. Once achieved, it required maintenance but not reconstruction. You maintained it, season by season, year by year, with the patient consistency of someone tending a garden that must never be allowed to look untended. The neighbourhood knew, in the way that neighbourhoods know things without the knowing ever being stated, that your family was connected, that your husband was a man of standing in a structure that was not entirely legitimate. This knowing existed in the background of all your social interactions and was, by mutual and wordless agreement, never brought to the foreground. People didn't ask. You did not tell. The neighbourhood functioned, as neighbourhoods of this kind always did, on a foundation of shared discretion that benefited everyone. The streets were safe. Certain problems resolved themselves without police involvement. Your window boxes were admired in spring. Everything proceeded with the surface appearance of ordinary life. And ordinary life, you had learned, was the most sophisticated disguise available. There were at times other women. You understood this as a feature of the landscape, not a surprise, because in this world certain things were simply expected quietly, on all sides, without any of it ever being named. Some wives chose fire, some chose ice. Most chose a third option, a kind of regal, total ignoring that was so complete it became its own form of power. You were not blind, you were strategic. Making a scene would have accomplished nothing useful and cost you a great deal. So you did what women in your position often did. You kept your house beautiful, your children well dressed, your dignity entirely intact, and you waited. Because the girlfriend was temporary, the wife was permanent, the children were permanent, the house, the name, the Sunday table, those were yours, and no amount of someone else's perfume was going to change that arithmetic. You understood the math clearly and you played it accordingly. The culture of the world your husband inhabited had, baked into it, a set of expectations about men and their extracurricular lives that were at once openly acknowledged within the community and entirely invisible to any formal accounting of it. The men were expected to be faithful to their families in the structural sense, present, providing, protective, publicly committed, while the definition of faithfulness did not necessarily extend to the territories that a more straightforward understanding of the word would cover. You had known this in some general sense before you married. The women around you had known it. It was one of those things absorbed from the environment before you were old enough to evaluate it, and by the time you were old enough to evaluate it, you were already inside the life. When you knew, and you always knew, eventually, because this neighbourhood watched everything, and your circle of women knew everything the neighbourhood knew, you processed it in private. Alone in the kitchen after the children were in bed, or in the 20 minutes of a long bath, or in the specific silence of early morning before anyone else was awake. You felt what you felt, and what you felt was not simple, because it never is, because these situations are never as clean as the strategic response you eventually deployed. You were hurt. You were angry in the cold, quiet way that is more dangerous than the loud kind. You were also, somewhere beneath the hurt, realistic in a way that was its own kind of grief, the grief of understanding your situation clearly and choosing, with full information, to remain in it. What you did not do was confront, escalate, or make it anyone else's business. Not because you were weak, the absolute opposite was true, but because you understood the calculus precisely. A confrontation produced nothing except a demonstration of vulnerability, and vulnerability was a currency you could not afford to spend. You had children in this household. You had a life built around a structure that, whatever its flaws, was yours. You were not going to dismantle it over a woman who would be replaced, in time, by another woman who would also be replaced. The wife endured. The others were footnotes. You chose to be the enduring thing. What you did instead was become, during these periods, even more excellent at the performance of your life. The house was cleaner, the dinners were better, you were warmer with your husband in public and cooler in private in a way precise enough to communicate everything without saying anything. You were, during these times, operating at the absolute peak of the social intelligence that your life had developed in you. And while it cost something, it always cost something, you paid it without displaying the cost. Because in this world, as in most worlds, dignity was the one thing that was entirely yours to maintain or surrender. You maintained it. Completely. Always. That was non-negotiable. You were a woman of faith. Genuinely. This is important to understand because it wasn't performance. You actually believed. You actually prayed. You actually sat in the pew on Sunday morning and meant every word. The fact that you were also living a life that existed in a complicated relationship with several of the commandments was something you had made a kind of peace with, in the way that people do when the contradictions are large enough and old enough, and surrounded by enough Sunday gravy. You confessed what you could. You kept a clean conscience where there was room for one. You lit candles for your husband's safety and your children's health, and occasionally, on the hard weeks, for your own strength to keep going. The church was also, practically speaking, the most respectable institution you could be visibly associated with. You were at every feast day, every school fundraiser, every early morning mass. Whatever else was true about your life, you were absolutely, unimpeachably a woman of the church. Nobody argued with that. The parish was the social and spiritual centre of your neighbourhood in a way that is difficult to fully convey to anyone who didn't grow up in a mid-century Italian-American Catholic community. The church was not a building you visited once a week. It was the organising structure of your entire social existence. Baptisms, communions, confirmations, weddings, funerals, all of it happened inside those walls, under the watch of priests who knew every family by name, every child by face, every household by its approximate standing in the community. The church was where your life was formally documented, publicly witnessed, spiritually anchored. It was also, practically speaking, the most socially legible institution available, and your consistent, visible, enthusiastic participation in it communicated something essential about the kind of family you were. The priest knew, in the way that neighbourhood priests always knew, something of what your husband was. He did not know the details. Details were not his department, but he understood the general shape of the family he was serving, as he understood the general shape of several families in his parish, because a parish priest in South Philly in 1953 was not a naive man. What the church offered, and what you accepted gratefully, was a space in which those details were irrelevant to your standing. You were a woman who attended Mass, who raised her children in the faith, who contributed to the parish, who organised the feast day bake sale with a competence that had become legendary in the way of things that had done very well over many consecutive years. In the church, you were defined by what you did inside it. That was enormously useful and also genuinely a relief. Confession presented its own particular architecture. You went every week. You confessed sins that were real, impatience with the children, an unkind thought about a neighbour, the small daily failures of a life lived under pressure. You did not confess knowledge that was not technically yours, because you had not committed the acts that produced it, and the theological precision of that boundary was something you had considered with more care than anyone would have guessed. You were not deceiving God. You were presenting your portion of the ledger, which was genuinely yours, which was a woman doing her best inside a situation she had not designed. The priest gave you your penance. You said it on your knees in the pew and you meant it. And then you went home and made dinner and the week continued. The faith held you in a way that nothing else quite did. In a life that required the daily suppression of so much curiosity, anger, fear, longing for a different kind of simplicity, prayer was the one place where the performance was off and the interior was available. You prayed honestly, which meant you prayed about things you never said aloud. You prayed for protection that went in every direction, covering your children and your husband and yourself in that order. You prayed, sometimes, for a clarity that you were not sure you actually wanted. God, you understood, could handle honesty. That was more than could be said for most of the other relationships in your life. Let's be very clear about one thing. You ran the house, completely. Your husband's world operated outside these walls, and your world operated inside them, and your world was a full-time enterprise requiring the administrative skills of someone running a small business, which, in a sense, you were. You managed the money you were given, you paid the bills in cash, you kept track of who was coming to dinner, and how many people that meant and what you'd need to buy, and whether there was enough of the good wine. You coordinated the children's school schedules, doctor appointments, and social obligations. You managed relationships with neighbours, relatives, priests, and occasionally nervous men who needed a hot meal and a quiet place to sit for an hour. You did all of this without a spreadsheet, without an assistant, and without ever once being thanked in a way that fully captured the scope of what you were doing. But the house ran. It always ran, and that was its own kind of satisfaction. The administrative complexity of your household was not visible to anyone who looked at it from outside, because you had designed it to look effortless, and the appearance of effortlessness is, ironically, the most labour-intensive output a household manager can produce. People saw a woman who always seemed to have the right food, who always had the house presentable, whose children were always at the right place at the right time in the right state of cleanliness. What they did not see was the planning infrastructure behind that outcome, the mental calendar that ran 6 days ahead, the knowledge of which children's events overlapped, the calculation of how many for dinner that accounted for the people who might arrive unannounced, which in your household was always a variable you planned for. The cash economy of your household required a particular kind of financial management that banks were not involved in. Bills were paid directly, landlords, utility offices, the children's school, in cash, in person, without documentation that could be examined later. You tracked what came in and what went out in your head, maintaining a running balance that was accurate to the dollar because inaccuracy was liability. You kept a physical reserve that was hidden in the house, in a place your husband knew and the children did not. which was the appropriate distribution of that knowledge. The reserve existed for the specific kind of emergency that this life occasionally produced, and knowing it was there was itself a form of stability. Unexpected guests were managed with a smoothness that required, underneath it, considerable logistics. A call in the afternoon saying there would be people for dinner meant an immediate mental recalculation of everything in the kitchen, what you had, what could be expanded, what needed to be purchased in the next 2 hours, what the table could accommodate with the leaves added. You did this calculation while continuing whatever you were doing at the moment of the call, and by the time you hung up the phone, you already had the plan. You did not appear to plan. You appeared to simply produce meals, space, hospitality, as though abundance were the natural state of your kitchen, which, through daily effort, it was. What you were running, understood clearly, was a support system for a complex operation, and the support system had to be invisible to function correctly. A household that showed stress, that visibly strained under its management, was a household that communicated something outward. Yours communicated nothing outward except order and warmth, and the smell of very good food. The stress stayed inside you, processed and recycled into the next task, the next meal, the next obligation met without visible cost. You were, by any reasonable accounting, managing more than most of the men who came to your table could have handled. They just never knew it, which was precisely the point. There were vacations, good ones. A week in Atlantic City in the summer, maybe Florida in the winter if the year had been particularly prosperous, which you understood to mean that business had gone well, in the broad undefined way that business always went well or didn't. You packed the children into the car and drove with the windows down and ate at restaurants where the owner came out personally to greet your husband, and the food was always excellent and the bill never arrived. You wore a swimsuit on the beach and let yourself be for a few days simply a woman on vacation, not a keeper of secrets, not a manager of appearances, just a person with sand between her toes and a husband who was, in these moments, relaxed in a way he never quite was at home. You didn't ask how the hotel was paid for. You didn't ask who the man was that your husband had a quiet conversation with on the boardwalk. You ate your fried clams and watched your children run toward the water, and you let yourself have the vacation. You had earned it. Atlantic City in the 1950s was a specific kind of American paradise. Boardwalk and ocean and salt air, and the particular democracy of the beach where everyone was for a few days simply a person in a bathing suit. The grand hotels along the shore operated on a system of favours, relationships, and mutual understandings that meant certain families were always accommodated, always given a good room, always made to feel expected and welcome. You arrived at the front desk and your husband was greeted by name by someone he had never mentioned, and you were shown to a room with an ocean view, and a fruit basket and a card that said something warm and non-specific. You thanked everyone and said how lovely and unpacked the children's bags and put on your swimsuit and went to the beach, because the beach was why you were here and the other arrangements were not your department. The children were transformed by vacation. This was the gift of it, to watch your children be entirely themselves, outside the neighbourhood, outside the school, outside the careful geography of home life that required its own forms of management even from them. On the beach they were loud and unself-conscious and ran directly at the ocean without any calculation at all, which was a quality you watched with something between envy and pure pleasure. You sat in a beach chair and read a magazine and felt, for consecutive hours, something that was very close to uncomplicated happiness. This was not nothing. In your life, uncomplicated happiness was a rare and valuable resource, and you were not going to waste it by asking questions about the hotel bill. Your husband on vacation was a version of him you cherished specifically. Away from the neighbourhood, away from the phone, away from the particular weight of his position, he was lighter. He built sandcastles with the younger children with a thoroughness that was almost funny. He had opinions about structural integrity and drainage. He bought everyone ice cream before dinner without being asked. He sat in the evening at a restaurant overlooking the water and drank a good glass of wine and talked about things that had nothing to do with business, and you sat across from him and remembered, as you periodically needed to, why you had married him in the first place. Not the man from the neighbourhood with the second coat of authority. Just this man, laughing about something, passing the bread, present for a week, in a way that was available to you completely. You held on to that version. You brought it home with you and kept it somewhere safe for the weeks ahead. There was a protocol for this, unspoken but understood, precise as a recipe handed down through women who had been here before you. When your husband was arrested, and if you stayed in this life long enough, it was usually when, not if, you called the lawyer. The number was already in your address book, listed under something neutral. You did not panic visibly. You did not speak to reporters. Not a word, not a nod, not eye contact on the courthouse steps that could be photographed and misinterpreted. You dressed well for the arraignment. You sat in the gallery with your back straight and your expression composed because the jury noticed, and so did everyone else. And a composed, well-dressed wife communicated something specific about the kind of man your husband was. Solid, respectable, a family man. You hugged him when you were allowed to, and you smiled for no one in particular, and you went home and made dinner for your children, and you did not cry until everyone was in bed. Then, and only then, you allowed yourself a moment, brief and private, before putting it away and starting again in the morning. The call, when it came, arrived in different forms depending on the circumstances. Sometimes your husband called from the precinct, his voice measured and brief, telling you what had happened and what you needed to do in that order. Sometimes another man called, a lawyer or an associate, with the same information delivered with the same measured brevity. Sometimes you found out from the radio, which was its own particular experience hearing your husband's names spoken in the clipped tone of a news bulletin while you were standing at the kitchen sink. On those occasions you turned off the radio, finished whatever you were doing at the sink, and then went to the phone. The order of operations was always the same. First the lawyer, then the women, your sister-in-law, one or two others who needed to know, then the children, handled with whatever age-appropriate explanation was available, which was usually some variation of Papa has to sort out a business matter and will be home soon, which was true enough. The lawyer was a particular kind of man, polished, experienced, specialised, and entirely non-judgmental about the nature of his clients' professional lives. He had represented your husband before, possibly, or represented other men in the same structure, which amounted to the same institutional knowledge. He was calm and efficient and told you what the process would look like, what you should and shouldn't do, and what the likely timeline was, and you listened and remembered everything and asked the questions that needed asking and thanked him and hung up. You did not fall apart in front of the lawyer. You did not fall apart in front of anyone except, briefly, yourself, in the privacy of the bathroom with the water running. The courthouse appearances required a specific costuming and a specific face. You wore the dark coat, the good heels, the composed expression. Not sad read as guilty. Not blank read as indifferent. Composed was the target. A woman who knew her husband, believed in him, and was present to demonstrate that belief in a public forum. You sat in the gallery, and you looked at the proceedings with the patient attention of someone who trusted the process, which was an acting performance of the first order, because your feelings about the process were considerably more complicated than trust. But the jury was watching, and the reporters were watching, and the other side was watching, and what they saw was a wife who had shown up, dressed, composed, present, and that sight communicated something in your husband's favour that no testimony could quite replicate. You knew this. You showed up accordingly. People always wanted to know why you stayed. It was a question that came, sometimes directly, more often as a look, a raised eyebrow from a sister, a careful silence from a friend who knew enough to be concerned. And the answer was never simple, because the reasons were layered and real and could not be reduced to the easy explanations people seem to want. You stayed because you loved him, genuinely, in the complicated way that love survives information that would have seemed impossible at the beginning. You stayed because your children needed their father's name and everything that came with it. You stayed because leaving, in this world, was not as uncomplicated as walking out a door. There were considerations, loyalties, obligations that wove through every part of your life like threads you couldn't pull without unravelling the whole thing. You stayed because your life, for all its silences and careful negotiations, was also full of family, of purpose, of a community that was yours. And perhaps, most honestly, you stayed because you were very, very good at this life. And being good at something, even a hard thing, is its own reason to remain. Leaving in the practical sense would have required a dismantling so total as to be unimaginable. Your house, your neighbourhood, your community, your social circle, your children's school, all of it was woven into a fabric whose threads ran back to your husband's position, in a structure that did not simply release people who decided they were done. The women who left, and occasionally one did not leave easily or entirely. They relocated usually to somewhere far from the neighbourhood, somewhere they had family who were not connected, and they built a quieter life at significant cost. The cost was not violence. The popular imagination gets this wrong. The cost was totality. You left everything, every friendship, every comfort, every familiar thing. You became a person with a before that you couldn't discuss. Some women found that bargain acceptable. You looked at it and saw what it would cost your children, and you stayed. And you stayed because of love, which deserves to be said plainly without qualification, because love was real and present and not cancelled by the complications of the life it existed inside. You loved your husband in the specific, worn-in way of people who have shared a life for years, through the difficult patches and the good ones, through the things that tested you and the things that held you. He was not a simple man, and he was not always a good man in the ways that phrase is straightforwardly understood. He was, however, your man, in the sense that the word carries its deepest meaning, known completely, chosen repeatedly, present in the way that matters most. That was not nothing. That was in fact quite a lot. The loyalty of the Mafia wife was one of the most examined and least understood phenomena of the era. People who looked at it from outside saw either victimhood or complicity, which were both too simple by orders of magnitude. What it actually was a choice made under conditions that were not of your design, made with full information, made every day rather than once, because staying is always a daily decision rather than a single one. You understood your life. You had mapped it thoroughly, in the quiet rooms of your own mind where the real accounting happened. And you had decided, with the clear-eyed realism of a woman who was not confused about anything, that this was the life you were living and you were going to live it with everything you had. Which you did, every day, completely, without apology to anyone, because you owed no one an explanation for the choices made in the interior of your own existence. You stayed, you loved, you endured, and you were, in the ways that mattered most to you, exactly who you had decided to be. Your household had its own vocabulary, and you were fluent in it. Business meant anything that was not your concern. He's a friend of ours meant something entirely specific. A problem meant something serious had happened, and the less you knew the better. Going out meant gone for an unknown duration, with no questions welcome upon return. He's a good man meant this particular person was vouched for and trusted. He's not right meant the opposite, and you filed it away immediately. There were words that were never said, phrases that circled around the actual thing the way water moves around a stone. You had learned to pass the silences, to read the meaning in a look exchanged across a table, to understand the difference between a quick trip out and a longer absence by things as subtle as which jacket your husband reached for. You had not been taught this language. You had absorbed it over years, the way you absorb any language you're surrounded by. Slowly at first and then all at once, until you couldn't imagine not knowing it. The vocabulary was not invented for your household alone. It was a shared linguistic inheritance, passed laterally among the families in this world, and refined over generations into something that functioned like a dialect, recognizable to those inside it, opaque to those outside it, and efficient in a way that ordinary language was not, because ordinary language named things, and naming things was precisely what this dialect was designed to avoid. You could conduct an entire significant conversation without once saying the word that the conversation was about. This was not evasiveness for its own sake. It was the logical linguistic product of a world in which clarity was a liability and ambiguity was armour. The phrase friend of ours was perhaps the most loaded 3 words in the vocabulary. It meant something precise. Man who was part of the same structure, known and vouched for, operating under the same codes. When your husband used it, you processed it and filed it instantly, because it told you something important about the person being introduced. This man is inside. He can be spoken to directly. He's not a stranger, and not an outsider, and not someone you manage with the same careful surface you deploy for the world at large. Friend of mine, by contrast, meant a civilian, someone connected by ordinary social ties, to be treated warmly but given nothing. The distinction mattered enormously and was communicated in 3 words. It was efficient in the way that all evolved systems become efficient, stripped to its essential information, delivered quickly, understood immediately. The silences were their own layer of the language. Certain topics, when they came up in conversation at the table, would produce a brief and almost imperceptible pause. Not uncomfortable, not alarmed, simply a natural space where the conversation rerouted itself around the obstacle without acknowledgement that an obstacle existed. You had learned to contribute to this rerouting automatically, picking up the conversation on the other side of the pause and carrying it in a new direction so smoothly that anyone watching would not have noticed the turn. You did this in company, at dinner tables, at family gatherings, in conversations with neighbours that wandered too close to certain boundaries. You were the conversational traffic management system of your household, directing flow away from closed roads without ever posting a sign. What was never said became, over time, as familiar as what was. The shape of a conversation was as informative as its content, because you could read, in what was omitted and what was circled and what was deflected, the approximate state of affairs in your husband's world. A week of brief conversations and early nights meant things were settled, an increase in traffic through the house, more calls, longer absences. Your husband's manner shifted just slightly towards something that looked like alertness rather than ease. These patterns, read through the vocabulary of silence, told you that something was in motion. You never asked what. You already knew enough. And that, in the end, was what the language of your household had been built to produce. Just enough understanding delivered indirectly to keep you informed and safe and deniable all at once. Here is something people tend to forget in the telling of lives like yours. There was also joy. Real, uncomplicated, ordinary joy. Sunday mornings with the kids still in their pyjamas and the smell of coffee and the radio on low. Christmas Eve with the whole family crowded into the living room and someone's uncle telling the same story he told every year and everyone laughing anyway. A summer evening on the stoop when the neighbourhood was quiet and your husband sat beside you and didn't say anything in particular, just sat there, and it was enough. Your children's school plays and first communions, and the afternoon your oldest came home with a perfect report card, and your husband picked her up off the ground and she shrieked with laughter. The life was complicated, yes. The life required things of you that most people would not recognize as a reasonable way to exist. But inside that life, woven through all of it, there was love, real, present, daily love. And no amount of revision makes that untrue. Christmas was the fullest expression of everything your household could be at its best. You began preparing in November, the cookies first, the ones that required multiple days and specific recipes that had come from your mother and her mother before her, written in the margins of a notebook in handwriting that got smaller as the page filled up. Anise and sesame and ricotta-filled pastries that required an afternoon's work and produced when they were done something so specific to your family and your table that eating one was like being handed a piece of the past still warm from the oven. The house was decorated completely. The tree went up the week before Christmas and was covered in ornaments that each had a history, a story, a year attached to them. You knew everyone. You had bought or received or made everyone. The decoration of the tree was a 2-hour domestic archaeology of your family's accumulated life, and you loved it without reservation. The summer evenings on the stoop were a quieter happiness, less elaborate and perhaps because of that more sustaining. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the children were in their rooms and the neighbourhood had moved into the particular ease of a warm evening, you and your husband would sometimes sit outside together in the last of the light. He would have a cigarette. You would have nothing, just the air, just the sound of the block settling into the evening. You did not talk much during these times. You had, between you, a language of silence that was not the careful operational silence of your household management, but something older and more intimate. The silence of two people who had been together long enough that presence itself was the communication. You sat on the stoop and the summer went on around you, and for those stretches of time the rest of it, the complexity, the management, the weight, was simply not present. It was just an evening. Just two people. Just enough. Your children's joy was the most complete happiness available to you, because it was untouched by anything. When your youngest laughed, the full, collapsing, helpless laugh of a child who finds something genuinely funny, the sound of it could reset your entire interior weather in approximately 3 seconds. You watched your children be happy, and you were happy without qualification, without the background hum of vigilance that accompanied almost every other state of your existence. They were the one area of your life that was simply, cleanly, entirely good. You had made them. You were raising them. They were well and loved and occasionally hilarious, and they had no idea yet how much work their uncomplicated happiness had cost. That was exactly right. That was the whole point. You raised your children with a very specific curriculum that had nothing to do with school. Rule 1. What happens in this house stays in this house. Rule 2. We do not discuss Papa's business with anyone, not your friends, not your teachers, not the nice man at the corner store who asks questions. Rule 3. If anyone ever asks you anything that feels strange, you come straight to me. They absorb these lessons with the adaptability of children who accept the conditions of their lives the way they accept the rules of any game, as simply the way things are done. Your children were not unhappy. They were in many ways sheltered, loved, and comfortable in ways their classmates were not. They also grew up knowing how to read a room, how to redirect a conversation, and how to present a perfectly pleasant face to the world while giving away nothing at all. These were skills, you told yourself, useful ones, and they were. The instruction was never delivered as a formal speech, which would have made it strange and memorable in the wrong way. It was built into the fabric of daily life through repetition and modelling and the occasional quiet correction when someone said something at the wrong moment to the wrong person. A child who mentioned at school something overheard at the kitchen table would come home to a gentle but thorough conversation about why certain things were family business. The conversation was never threatening. It was patient and warm and absolutely clear. By the second or third such conversation, the lesson was learned, and after that the children managed themselves with a competence that you found, privately, both impressive and a little heartbreaking, because no child should need to be quite that socially careful, and yet yours were, and they were fine, and you made sure they were fine, which required the same constant invisible effort that everything else in your life required. They learned, very early, to identify a question that had an agenda behind it. A neighbour who asked with a certain studied casualness what their father did for work. A teacher who seemed interested in the family in a way that went beyond normal contact. A new friend whose parents were asking questions through the friend. Your children developed, without being taught the formal skill, a sensitive instrument for detecting when a question was not quite what it appeared to be. This was not cynicism. They were warm, open, socially confident children. It was discernment, which is a different thing, and is, in fairness, a quality that serves a person well anywhere. They trusted the right people and gave the right amount to everyone else, which is a social calibration that many adults spend their whole lives failing to achieve. The telephone was a particular area of instruction. If someone called when you were not home and their father was not home, the children had a script, warm, friendly, and entirely uninformative. He's not here right now. Can I take a message? No, I'm not sure when he'll be back. Yes, I'll let him know you called. Then they wrote down the name and number and left it on the counter and mentioned it when you came home. They did not ask who it was. They did not try to have a conversation. They were 8 and 10 and 12 years old, and they handled phone calls with the professional composure of a receptionist who's been doing the job for decades. You told yourself this was practical. It was also, you knew, a thing that children should not have to know. You held both of those truths at once, because that was the kind of holding your life required. The years accumulated and you changed and the life changed and some things got easier and some things did not. The children grew up and left, and the house was quieter, and your husband was slower than he had been, and the men who had sat at your Sunday table over the decades were fewer now, some gone in ways you didn't think about directly, some just gone in the ordinary way of getting old. Your husband still went out. The phone still rang at inconvenient hours. Some things never changed because they were structural, woven into the fabric of who he was, and you had long since made your peace with that fabric. What changed was you, steadily and with great composure. You became the elder now, the woman the younger wives looked to across the church pew, the one who had navigated this life long enough that your presence alone communicated something. You had survived, you had endured, and that in this world was its own form of authority. Age brought, among other things, a decrease in the ambient anxiety that had characterized the early years, not because the circumstances had changed substantially, but because you had, because the years of practice had converted what was once a performance into something closer to a natural state, and the energy that had once gone into maintaining the performance was now available for other things, like sitting still, like enjoying a cup of coffee slowly in the morning before the day started, like noticing things about your own life that the busyness of the earlier years had not permitted. You had not mellowed, exactly. You had distilled. The unnecessary things had been burned off by time, and what remained was a concentrated version of the person you had always essentially been. Clear-eyed, composed, capable, and completely without illusions about the life she was living. The Sunday table was different. The crowd was smaller, the generation older, and there was a quality to those later Sunday dinners that the earlier ones had not had. A kind of weight, a consciousness of time passing that gave the ritual a different texture. You still made the gravy. You would make the gravy until you couldn't stand at the stove, and probably you would find a way after that. But the men around the table were, many of them, the survivors of something. A world that had been broader and louder and more present in your kitchen, and which had contracted around its losses. You cooked for fewer people, and you felt those absences at the table the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Constantly, involuntarily, in a way you eventually stopped noticing and then noticed again. The younger wives sought you out in the way that junior employees seek out the person who has been in the institution longest, not necessarily for specific advice, since specific advice was not a currency this world traded in, but for the reassurance of your presence. The fact of you, having navigated this life for this long, and arrived at this point still standing, still composed, still making the gravy, communicated something to them that no words could have communicated as efficiently. She's still here. She's still whole. This can be survived. You understood that this was the thing they needed from you, and you provided it, showing up at church and at coffee and at family occasions with the same uprightness you had always carried, because uprightness in your world was not just personal dignity, it was a public service to the women who were watching to see how this was done. Here is a small, almost funny truth. Some of your neighbours knew exactly what your husband was. Not the details, never the details, but the general shape of it was not invisible in a neighbourhood where everyone had grown up together and everyone's cousin knew someone. And what did they think? They thought, mostly, that you were a good woman in a complicated situation, and they respected the way you handled it. They respected the clean house and the well-behaved children, and the fact that you never once made it their problem. You were, in their estimation, a woman who had kept her dignity, which in 1950s working-class America was perhaps the highest possible praise. One or two of them quietly appreciated that the neighbourhood was, in fact, very safe, because nobody caused trouble where your husband lived. Nobody said this out loud. Nobody needed to. The neighbourhood's understanding of your family operated on a collective gentleman's agreement that was so thoroughly internalised it required no maintenance. Nobody brought it up. Nobody asked questions that would require uncomfortable answers. Nobody gossiped, at least not in ways that would travel back to you or create problems, because creating problems in the vicinity of your husband's household was a thing that people understood without being told was inadvisable. The social fabric of the neighbourhood was, in this way, self-regulating. It maintained the silence automatically because the silence served everyone, and because the consequences of breaking it were understood to exist even if they were never specified. Old Mr. Ferraro next door had known your husband since they were boys. He knew the shape of the life completely. He also knew that your husband's presence on the block meant that his car had never been broken into, that the teenagers who had once congregated loudly on the corner had found somewhere else to be, and that when his furnace had failed one February he had mentioned it to you over the fence, and it had been repaired within 48 hours by a man who declined payment. Mr. Ferraro had no complicated feelings about any of this. He brought vegetables from his garden in the summer and received Sunday gravy in return, and thought of your family as good neighbours, which was both entirely accurate and a somewhat incomplete accounting of the situation. He was fine with the incompleteness. It suited him perfectly. The younger couples on the block occupied a more ambiguous position, new enough to the neighbourhood that they had not grown up inside its specific codes, but present long enough to have absorbed the basic operating principles. They understood that your family was not entirely ordinary without understanding the specifics, and they responded to this understanding with the social instinct of people who have correctly identified that something is adjacent to them that is large enough to treat with respect. They were friendly with you, genuinely, because you were a good neighbour who had earned genuine friendliness, and they didn't probe because probing struck them correctly as unwise. This was not fear, it was a sensible reading of their environment, which is what people do when they're paying attention. What everyone agreed on across the street and up the block, and among the women in the church pew and the men at the corner on Saturday morning, was that you personally were beyond reproach. This was important, and it was the product of years of deliberate effort, and it was also genuinely, simply true. You were a good woman, you were a good neighbour, you raised good children, and you kept a beautiful house, and you showed up when people needed you, and you never once made your life anyone else's burden. The complicated parts, the parts that operated in a register the neighbourhood understood but didn't name, were not your doing. They were the weather of your particular life, and you had always handled the weather with such complete composure that people forgot sometimes that it was anything other than ordinary. When you were among the other wives, really among them, at someone's kitchen table with the kids in the other room, and the coffee gone cold because you'd been talking too long, there was a different kind of language. Not the official silence, not the careful performance for outsiders. Something quieter and more honest, spoken in the gaps between words that were technically about something else. You could communicate an entire situation in a raised eyebrow and a slow sip of coffee. You could signal that things were difficult at home, that you were tired, that something had happened that you couldn't name, and the woman across the table would understand completely and pour you more coffee and say nothing that could be repeated. This was the real intimacy of your life, not your husband who you loved but could not fully reach. These women who understood without asking, who had been through the same architecture of silence and who kept each other upright, quietly, with no credit and no audience, for decades. The eyebrow was the most efficient instrument in the vocabulary. It could carry, depending on its precise angle and duration, any of the following. Something happened that I cannot discuss but that you should know about. Or, that man cannot be trusted, remember this. Or, things are difficult right now in a way that will resolve itself. Or, perhaps most frequently, I know and I know that you know, and we are going to sit here and drink this coffee and be absolutely fine. The eyebrow was not a gesture, it was a sentence, delivered in a fraction of a second, received and understood by women who had been reading it for years. If this skill had been available for deployment in any other professional context, it would have been worth an advanced degree. The conversations you had among yourselves operated in 3 simultaneous registers. The top register was the surface conversation about children, about recipes, about the price of things at the market, about a television program someone had watched. This was real conversation, not performance. You were genuinely interested in each other's children, and genuinely had opinions about the market prices, and genuinely watched the same television programs. The surface was not fake, it was simply not the whole thing. Beneath the surface ran a second register, the one that transmitted real information in compressed, deniable form. A particular way of describing a situation that sounded like ordinary domestic complaint but meant something more specific to the women receiving it. A question asked a certain way that requested information in a form that could be provided without technically being given. And beneath that, the third register, the one that required no words at all. The simple fact of sitting together, of showing up at each other's tables, of being present. That presence in itself said everything that the other 2 registers couldn't quite reach. The coffee was cold before the conversation was finished, always. This was a reliable indicator of a real kitchen table conversation rather than a social one. In a social conversation, you drank the coffee while it was still good. In these conversations, the coffee was forgotten because something more essential than coffee was happening. You were being witnessed by women who knew the specific weight of what you carried, who had the same weight on their own shoulders, who were not going to perform shock or pity or unsolicited advice, who were simply going to sit with you in the actual truth of your life and let that be enough. In a world that required you to perform ease at all times and in all directions, being in a room where the performance was off, even briefly, even partially, was the closest thing to rest that your life made available. You took it when it came. You were grateful for it every single time. There were things you learned that nobody warned you about, because nobody talks about the texture of a life, only its broad outlines. Nobody told you that the waiting would be its own full-time job, waiting for your husband to come home, waiting to find out if news was bad, waiting out an arrest, waiting for a situation to resolve itself in whatever way situations resolve themselves, which you did not ask about. Nobody told you that the silence would be so complete that some days it would feel like a physical thing, like furniture you had to move around. Nobody told you that you would become genuinely, skillfully expert at appearing fine, and that this expertise would eventually feel so natural that you would sometimes have to remind yourself that it was a skill, not a state of being. Nobody told you that the loneliness could coexist with a house full of people, that you could be surrounded by family every single day and still feel, somewhere behind your eyes, profoundly alone. Nobody told you these things. You learnt them all the same. The waiting was perhaps the most underestimated element of the whole enterprise. People think of this life in terms of its dramatic episodes, the arrests, the courtrooms, the envelopes, the men in suits. But the texture of the everyday life was not dramatic. It was the low, continuous hum of not knowing, of having learned not to ask, of watching the clock at 11 at night and understanding that asking when he would be home was not something you did. And so you waited without the anchor of an expected time, which is a specific, kind of suspended state that has no good name but that you inhabited for years, in the evenings, with one ear on the children upstairs and one eye on the front window. You read, you mended things, you watched television without really watching it. You waited with the disciplined patience of someone who has made peace with the fact that the waiting is simply part of the hours, the way the weather is part of the day. The loneliness was the thing that surprised you most, because from outside the life looks so crowded. And it was crowded. People in and out, family on Sundays, neighbours and church friends, and the constant social activity of a household like yours. But the specific loneliness of not being able to be fully known by anyone, of carrying a comprehensive interior understanding of your own life that you could never put on the table with another person, that loneliness lived in a very specific location inside you, distinct from ordinary social solitude. It was the loneliness of the unspoken, of a marriage that was real and warm and present and also contained a large room that was always locked, even to you, even after years, because the locked room was the protection, and the protection was the deal. What nobody told you, and what turned out to be the most sustaining discovery of the whole life, was that you were stronger than you had known. Not the kind of strong that comes from not feeling things. You felt everything, all of it, in the privacy of the interior rooms where the map was kept. The kind of strong that continues after the feeling, that absorbs the impact and remains upright and makes dinner and answers the door and raises children who are healthy and whole. You had not known, before this life built it in you, that you contained that particular quality. You would have preferred to find out differently, but you had found it, and it was yours, and nothing that had put it there could ever take it away from you. That was the trade. It was not a good, one by any ordinary accounting, but it had made you something, and that something, in the end, was real. By the end of the 1950s and into the 60s, things were shifting. The FBI was better organised and more relentless. The newspapers were more aggressive. The neighbourhoods were changing as families moved to the suburbs and the old tight-knit geography of the life began to loosen. Your children had grown up and some of them had married out of the world entirely, which was a relief in a way you kept mostly to yourself. The country was changing, and the rules of the game were changing with it, and the kind of invisibility that had once been possible was becoming harder to maintain. You adapted, because adapting was what you did. You were, at this point, extraordinarily experienced at adjusting to conditions you hadn't chosen and making them livable. But you noticed the changes. You noticed the younger wives, who hadn't learned the old rules the same way, who were louder and less careful. You noticed your husband noticing things too. The world was speeding up, and the life you had built your expertise around was becoming, slowly, something different. You kept making Sunday gravy. You kept the house clean. You kept your mouth shut. Some rules hold regardless of era. The 1951 Kefauver hearings, broadcast on television to an audience of millions, had put organised crime into American living rooms in a way that made the subsequent decade a different proposition from the one before it. Before the hearings, the general public understood that organised crime existed the way they understood that weather existed, as an abstraction, vaguely present, not personally concerning. After the hearings, it was a named, faced, publicly debated phenomenon with personalities attached to it and congressional interest in its dismantling. This changed the conditions of the life in ways that were incremental but cumulative. Each year brought a little more scrutiny, a little more legal infrastructure aimed directly at the world your husband inhabited, a little more pressure on the invisible architecture that the life depended on. You felt this pressure in the texture of your days without anyone naming it directly. Things were tighter, conversations were shorter. Your husband was more careful in ways you noticed, even though he said nothing. The move to the suburbs for families that made it represented a specific kind of adaptation, a physical relocation that created distance from the neighbourhood infrastructure that had made the old life possible, in exchange for a new kind of respectability, a ranch house and a car in a driveway, and children in public school with kids whose fathers definitely worked in insurance. Some of the wives you had known for years found themselves in this new context, and you would see them occasionally, and they were fine, a little quieter, a little looser in the specific way of people who have set down, something they had been carrying for a long time. You were not sure whether you envied them or not. The neighbourhood was yours. It was where you knew how things worked. The suburbs were someone else's grammar, and you were not sure you had the patience to learn it at this point in your life. What the shifting era required, above all else, was the same thing every era of your life had required: adaptation without complaint, adjustment without announcement, the quiet, continuous work of remaining functional and composed inside conditions that were not of your choosing and not entirely in your control. This you could do. This you had always done. The specific content of what needed managing changed, the nature of the threats, the profile of the scrutiny, the geography of the social world. But the fundamental skill was the same. You were a woman who had learned to navigate. The water had changed its current. You adjusted your stroke. The gravy was on, the house was clean, you were still. Here is the thing you would never have said out loud, because pride was not something you displayed, not in this life, where you kept your interior life very much to yourself. But if you had said it, if someone had sat you down and asked you sincerely what you were proud of, you would have said, the children, always the children, that they grew up whole and decent and knew how to work and love and be present in their lives, despite everything that swirled around their childhood that they only half understood. You would have said, the fact that I never broke, that through every difficult year, every unexplained absence, every held breath on the courthouse steps, you did not break. You bent, certainly. You accommodated things no reasonable person should have to accommodate. But you did not break, and the unbrokenness of you was a thing you held on to quietly, like a coin in a pocket, something small and solid and entirely your own. You made a life out of impossible materials. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The children were the achievement that required no qualification. You could look at them, grown, functional, loving, capable of being loved, and feel a pride so clean it had no complicated edges. Everything else in your life had complicated edges. The children were the exception. They had grown up inside the silence and the management and the careful performance of normalcy, and they had emerged from it as people, whole and actual people, with their own desires and humours and loves and difficulties that had nothing to do with the architecture of your household. That emergence from the conditions of their childhood into the independence of their adult lives was the central project of your existence, and you had completed it. Whatever else was true about the life you had lived, you had done that. They were fine. More than fine. You had made sure of it. The pride in your own endurance was a quieter and more complicated thing because it required acknowledging that the endurance had been necessary, which required acknowledging the full weight of what had required enduring. You did not spend much time on that accounting in the daylight hours, but in the honest interior of yourself, in the room where the map was kept, you knew what you had carried and for how long and with what consistency and at what cost. You had not been defeated by it. You had not become diminished by it, had not become bitter or closed or unable to be present in your own life. You had, through what you suspected was an almost unreasonable degree of internal effort, remained yourself. That is harder than it sounds. Many women in positions not unlike yours had not managed it. The bitterness had won, or the numbness had won, or the performance had eventually consumed the person performing it and left nothing interior at all. You had not let that happen. You were still, underneath the composure and the lipstick and the perfectly clean kitchen, the woman who had existed before the life had layered itself over her. That woman was intact. You were proud of that in the specific private way of someone who knows the cost of a thing and therefore understands its value precisely. The house, too, was a source of a pride that was modest and real. You had built something in those walls, not just a well-managed household, but a place where people were fed and children were loved, and whatever was complicated about the life outside its walls stopped at the threshold and did not come inside in its full form. You had made a home that was, inside its own four walls, genuinely good. The Sunday table was real. The Christmas tree was real. The summer evenings on the stoop were real. None of it was performance. The performance was for the outside world. Inside, it was simply your life, made as well as you knew how to make it, which it turned out was very well indeed. That was worth being proud of. Quietly, in the pocket, like the coin. Long after, the specific events had faded, after the particular people and the particular addresses and the particular years had blurred into a general past, what remained was something harder to categorize. A way of moving through the world that your children inherited without knowing where it came from. A comfort with silence, an instinct for discretion, an ability to read a room before speaking in it, a commitment to feeding people well and keeping the table set and showing up, a capacity for loyalty that was not naive because it had been tested but genuine because it had survived the testing. The grandchildren would not know your specific history. They would not know the weight of what you had carried or the particular nature of the silence you had kept for decades. But they would have, somewhere in how you taught them to live, the trace of a woman who had managed the unmanageable with her head held up and her sauce on the stove. That is the inheritance. It is quieter than history books. It is more honest than most of them. The qualities that the life had built in you, the discretion, the composure, the extraordinary capacity for patience, the ability to inhabit a difficult situation without being broken by it, were not qualities that could be verbally transmitted. They were qualities that passed through observation, through proximity, through the long, slow education of watching someone you love navigate something hard and remain intact. Your children had watched you for decades. They had absorbed, without knowing what they were absorbing, the specific texture of how you moved through the world, the way you answered a door, the way you managed unexpected company, the way you stayed present and warm under conditions that would have undone a less disciplined person. They carried these things into their own lives and deployed them in contexts that had nothing to do with the specific world that had forged them, Because competencies born in specific conditions are still competencies. They travelled. The grandchildren knew you as a woman who cooked magnificently and kept a beautiful home and was always, in every interaction, completely present, interested in them, warm with them, possessed of a quality of attention that made them feel, when they were with you, like the most important people in the room. They did not know that this quality of attention had been developed in a world where reading people accurately was a survival skill. They experienced it as love, which it also was, because the two things, skill and love, had become, over the years, indistinguishable in you. You were attentive because you cared and because you had learned that attention was protection, and those two motivations had fused so completely that you could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The grandchildren just knew that Grandma really listened. They were right. She always had. The women of your generation and your world are not written about extensively in history books, because history books favour the people who acted in the public record, and you had spent your life carefully absent from the public record. You were, by design and by necessity, invisible to documentation. But the social history of organised crime in America is not fully told without accounting for the women who maintained its households, raised its children, managed its money, deflected its investigators, and kept its secrets with a discipline and an intelligence that was, by any honest measure, extraordinary. You were the infrastructure of a world that got all the dramatic attention. You were the part that held it up. That is not a small thing. That is in fact the kind of thing that history should make more room for. Someday, perhaps, it will. Until then, the inheritance travels in other ways, in the way a grandchild sits with her back to the wall in a restaurant without knowing why, in the way a grown son pauses before answering a question he's not sure about, in the way a family still sets a full table on Sunday because that is simply what you do. The specific story is gone. The shape of the woman remains. It always does, and so here we are. At the end of a life lived in the in-between spaces between what was known and what was said, between the public face and the private one, between a world that asked everything of you and a world that would never fully acknowledge what you gave. She was not a hero in the way that word usually gets used. She did not march into battle or make speeches or leave behind documents that historians would later argue about. She left behind a clean house and well-raised children and a Sunday table that was always set, and a silence so complete and so disciplined that it looked, from the outside, like simplicity. It was the opposite of simplicity. It was one of the most complex performances a human being can sustain, the performance of an ordinary life, maintained with extraordinary precision for decades without an audience that ever fully understood what it was watching. She carried things that had no name and no place to be put down. She navigated a world that gave her no map and no credit and no exit, that didn't cost more than she was willing to pay. And she did it with her lipstick on, and her floors clean, and her sauce on the stove, which sounds like a small thing until you understand everything that was happening underneath it, and then it sounds like what it actually was. A feat of endurance so quiet it could be mistaken for ease. Tonight, as you pull your blanket up and let the day go and feel the weight of your body against something soft and warm and entirely safe, maybe spare a thought for her. For the women who kept entire worlds running from inside a kitchen, who knew everything and said nothing and showed up anyway, every single day, because showing up was what they had decided to do. And they were not the kind of women who went back on a decision. She is gone now, mostly, that particular world. The neighbourhoods have changed. The life has changed. The specific silence she maintained has dissolved into history, which is still working out what to do with her. But the gravy recipe survived. The table is still set on Sundays somewhere, by a woman who learned it from a woman who learned it from her. And that, in its quiet, stubborn, sauce-scented way, is enough. Rest now. You're safe. And you didn't have to keep a single secret to get here.